So hello everybody, good morning and welcome back to the fourth and final day of the 2020 Sub-Sahara Spectrum Management Conference. We really appreciate you all joining us once again for today's sessions, and we've got another fascinating day ahead of us, and I'm going to be talking about the schedule for today very shortly. So looking forward to some more excellent discussions today. Before we start though, I just wanted to mention a couple of just small things. So first of all, I wanted to once again say a big thank you to all of our sponsor and partner organizations who have been involved in the event. So you can see all the logos, no, that side, on the screen beside me here. We really do appreciate all of their involvement at the event, and I think without them the event wouldn't have been possible. So thank you very much again to all of you. I just also wanted to mention the level of participation at the event as well. So we've had a look now at the numbers we've had so far at the conference. I think we've had about 480 people who have joined the conference via the actual event platform itself. And we've had more than 300 who've been tuning in via the live streams we've had running on YouTube and Twitter. So overall, we've had more than 800 people over the 3 days of the event so far. So that's a fantastic total, and we're really, really pleased and say thank you to all of you for joining us, and we do really appreciate your involvement. So on to today. Today's sessions, we've looked so far at specific bands. We've looked at things like the digital divide. We have looked at WRC. Today, we're moving on to focus more on 5G. So this morning, we're focusing specifically on 5G. We're starting with a thinking point, which I'll be introducing our speaker, Scott McKenzie, very shortly for that, looking at spectrum pricing. We're then looking at views from key stakeholders on what key hopes, plans, and expectations for 5G are. Before we move to our final session of the morning, which is going to be looking at continuing the path towards a harmonized continental 5G strategy. And then this afternoon, as you see, we have a session that's going to be looking at different priorities, where the priorities should lie for regulators in bringing spectrum to market. Before we aim to wrap up all of the discussions so far and have a final comments from people and a final closing ceremony, and have some final opportunities for all of you guys to get involved using the have your say option as well. So once again, a busy day ahead of us, and really looking forward to what I'm sure are going to be some very fruitful discussions. So without further ado, I would like to then bring up our first speaker for the day, and that is Scott McKenzie from Coleago. So Scott, welcome. So Scott is with us, and as I mentioned this morning, the focus is going to be on 5G. So we thought it would be very useful to start off with a presentation to kind of set the team, to talk a little bit about spectrum pricing. So Scott's going to be doing that and looking to address the question of spectrum pricing, and will that make or break the 5G momentum. So Scott, we're looking forward to that, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for being here. I just wanted to start with the presentation, if we can, Dan. Just basically to, the purpose of this morning's discussion is really to get you thinking about 5G spectrum pricing. It's obviously early days in terms of allocation of 5G in Africa, but we think there are clear lessons to be learned from other markets in terms of spectrum pricing, and there is a real danger that if regulators get this wrong, governments get this wrong, that it could hinder the development of 5G, and that's what we would this is the point we'd like to make in this presentation. So next slide, please, Dan. Before I begin discussing 5G pricing, though, I wanted to make a shameless plug for my company. For those of you that don't know us, Coleago Consulting is a specialist TMT advisory company. We have been around since 2001. There are about 30 people in the firm. We specialize in various areas. Spectrum is probably our biggest area, spectrum valuation and auctions, as well as policy and licensing. We work for regulators and operators. We're experts on network sharing, on broader telecommunications regulation, as well as strategy and business planning and transaction services. Next slide, Dan. In terms of the recent spectrum projects that we've worked on in the last 3 years, We've been averaging typically about 12 to 15 spectrum projects a year, and we've worked extensively on virtually every continent on spectrum issues, so including licensing, including auctions, advising bidders and regulators. We just move to the next slide, please. So I'd really like to start by saying that clearly 5G is a big imperative for many of the governments around the world, both in developing countries and in developed markets. There's a lot of political capital being expended in terms of trying to get 5G up and running. I haven't actually, not that we're visiting many countries at the moment, but when I haven't actually been to a country that hasn't said that it wants to be a world leader in 5G. Virtually every market is looking at this, and that's true in Africa as well. Developing countries see this as an opportunity to reboot their economies and actually participate in the fourth industrial revolution. And we'll be hearing a lot more about that from some of the later speakers. We just move to the next slide. And if we look at what's going on in the industry, we see that there's actually dramatic growth in data traffic. And that's true on every continent. Basically, growth is forecast to go up 5-fold. And although sub-Saharan Africa, the data usage levels are a lot lower, it's still projected to grow over 4 times in the next 5 years. So this is from the Ericsson Mobility Report. And part of this traffic increases, a large part of it's going to be due to the adoption of 5G, but even 4G devices are also seeing increased usage, and clearly a lot of it's being driven by things like video. The COVID pandemic is probably accelerating this trend. We're obviously seeing more remote and home working, more video communications, mobile networks are probably less affected by this than fixed, and there's more traffic in residential areas. So it's a series of challenges for the mobile industry there. But the good news is demand for the basic service for mobile data is going up, and that is positive. Perhaps we can go to the next slide. And there's a lot of there'll be a lot of sessions about what the capabilities of 5G are. There have been a number in this conference. I don't really want to get into all of that, but clearly 2 of the things that 5G is promising to deliver are better user data rates, and also, as far as the operators are concerned, greater capacity in the network in terms of megabits per second per meter squared. And in fact, 5G offers the possibility to radically increase those capabilities in networks. And clearly, there's going to be a lot of need for spectrum in order to deliver that. If we just go to the next slide. In order to deliver both of those things, you are going to need not just the existing legacy spectrum that we have today, on the left, the legacy bands, so the sub 1 gigahertz, and then the spectrum between 1 to 3 gigahertz. We're clearly going to need C-band. There's 6 gigahertz potentially on the horizon. It's a candidate band for mobile, which is going to be probably discussed at WRC 23. And then there are other even higher bands, the millimeter wave bands, which will also enable the very high capacity, very cheap capacity for operators. So this is the sort of view if we look at Region 1 in sort of 5 to 10 years' time, that these bands will have by then have all been allocated. If we go to the next slide. So 5G is going to see a lot of spectrum being allocated, and this is what we see in many Region 1 countries. Obviously, it varies greatly from individual markets, and some sub-regions within regions are going to take longer to allocate the spectrum. But effectively, we're going to see something like a 7 or 8-fold or more increase in spectrum, more than 10-fold increase, in fact, on this graph. And regulators really need to think carefully about how they're going to price this. So if we go to the next chart, and one of the reasons they've got to think carefully about this is that so far 5G has not delivered any price premium for operators. The two most advanced markets in the world, Korea and the US, in terms of 5G, we haven't so far seen any real, strong uplift in ARPU. Some operators in Korea, the smaller one, for instance, have seen some increase in revenue growth. But so far, what we see is actually that in terms of the pricing, the operators who are offering 5G tariffs are actually pitching them at a price just below what the 4G tariff was. So there is no premium for 5G. And this was a study we did last year at the launch of 5G in Korea. We looked at the data plans that were available from the major operators, and it was quite surprising that they actually even seemed to cut the prices in certain tariffs. And it was the same in the US as well. We saw that with AT&T last year as well. So basically, I don't think the mobile industry is going to see a big premium being paid for 5G. Consumers will, they just buy mobile data. They don't care whether it's 4G or 5G. What they care about is getting what they want is actually more for less every year. And if we go to the next slide, and this is the dilemma that the industry faces. What we see is that traffic is continuing to grow at 25 to 30% in many countries, and demand for the underlying service is very strong, but they're not able to monetize this increased demand. So most operators, mobile operators we work with, are lucky if they have inflationary growth. Some of them even see declining revenues. So it's a serious problem, and obviously this is great for the consumer. The consumer is the winner in all of this because of all this competition. But the difficulty for the operators will be to generate any sort of return on this increased demand. Perhaps we go to the next slide. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the telecoms industry has been one of the worst performing sectors. If you look over the last 5 years, you look at the telecom MSCI telecoms index, for example, in most regions of the world, it's been a disaster area. And if we want to attract investment into this industry, if we want to have these new services, and we want the networks, and the consumers want the capabilities to be there in the infrastructure, then we have to be careful about making the industry an attractive investment opportunity. So if we just go to the next slide. So what we see is that, in the industry, what's been happening is that there's been declining profit margins, stagnant revenues and declining margins in virtually all markets. And then at the same time, we've got increasing network investment, and then we've also got to buy spectrum as well. And what this means is that the return on investment for the whole industry has been declining, and it has been for most of the last decade. And this is a serious issue. If the industry is going to invest, then these returns, investors have to get a return on their capital, at least equal to their cost of capital. And 5G will potentially worsen this situation. Many of the operators still haven't actually seen a return on their 4G investments yet. And now they're going to have to build new networks based on 5G and buy a lot more spectrum. The next slide, Dan. So we've been doing a case study, which we've been working on with the European Commission, looking in Europe at what the difference in spectrum pricing means in terms of network development. And we've been working on this. It was a project that ran over the summer, and looking to look at try to analyze how much the industry in each country is spending on spectrum. And if we go to the next page, what we've done is we've developed an annualized cost of spectrum. And we're trying to compare basically how much does the industry spend on spectrum compared to the revenues. Now, it's a very crude mix and crude method, very simple analysis. And some of the economists will probably say that this isn't necessarily the right way of looking at it. But in terms of policymakers, it's a very simple metric that can be used to discuss with politicians and with governments and with regulators. So what we did was we went and looked at how much was spent on spectrum in auctions, how much was spent in upfront fees in the past, and looked at the license duration. We then converted those upfront fees into an annualized cost of spectrum. And then we added any annual spectrum fees if they're applicable. And we came up with an annualized cost of spectrum. We then compared that with the percentage of, or compared that with the industry revenue to get a percentage of the annual revenue that's spent on spectrum. So if we go to the next page. And it was quite interesting when we looked at a lot of European countries. We found that there were huge variations in how much countries charge for spectrum. And probably what was also more interesting was that the countries that had the lower spectrum fees tended to have the higher or the better network infrastructure. And particularly if you were to look at this list on the right there, if you look at countries like Latvia or Estonia or Finland, they all had excellent infrastructure. Sweden as well. Particularly the countries that had annualized spectrum costs below about 10% of industry revenues. That seemed to be where the dividing line was. And if we look at the next slide, we look at Finland in particular. Finland is probably one of the world leaders in mobile. Obviously, it's got Nokia there, but it's in terms of data usage, and the annualized cost of spectrum is the lowest in Europe actually, and yet it has the highest or the most network capacity, spare network capacity compared to other markets. So we do see, and we did find a correlation between high spectrum, between low spectrum fees and superior network performance. If you go to the next page. And one of the things I think I would really like to urge regulators and governments in Africa is to try and avoid some of the problems that happened with 4G. We've obviously done quite a lot of work in Africa. We've seen quite a number of the spectrum allocation processes up close, and we have seen we did see in the past from the 4G auctions quite a few unrealistic expectations on spectrum pricing, And two most obvious examples I could think of were Ghana and Senegal, when there were high prices, and basically a large number of the operators in the industry decided just not to buy the spectrum. It was too expensive. They couldn't justify the reserve price, and this is meant that it's holding back the development of the country, because there are many other benefits that flow from having these networks deployed. It's well understood, the relationship between economic growth and good infrastructure. I think everybody agrees on that. And if these assets, these resources are not being used, then they're not generating any additional economic benefits. And we saw this in both Ghana and in Senegal, where there were very high expectations. And in Senegal, the operators even boycotted the auction. So I think my suggestion to regulators and governments in Africa, when we're thinking about 5G, let's look back at some of the issues that happened around the 4G pricing and learn from that. Can we go to the next slide? And I think there are many other policy objectives aside from revenue generation. And I know it's very it's clear governments are struggling with budget deficits. Given the COVID crisis, it's very easy to think, well, we'll just raise some extra money from the industry. But the long-term implications of that, if the spectrum doesn't get allocated, if the network operators don't have the money to invest in the network once they've bought the spectrum, is that it actually holds the country back, and it doesn't promote investment and innovation. So clearly, governments have a duty to sell the spectrum efficiently and to raise for the public to get a reasonable amount of money for the spectrum. But if the prices are too high and the operators can't afford it, then clearly that will be bad ultimately for consumers in the long run. So really, that's really my presentation. I'd now like to ask if there are any questions from the audience.
Hi, Scott. Thank you very much for that, and really interesting presentation. And I think a great way to kick off our discussions on 5G today. So you asked if there are any questions. We do have some questions coming in. So first of all, I'd like to put you a question that has been raised by Graham McDonald from Apple. So Graham says that 5G is more than licensed IMT 2020, but why is there little or no mention of 5G license exempt and indeed Wi-Fi? And he asks, do the operators have sufficient money to acquire all these licensed frequency bands? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Scott.
Well, yeah, clearly license exempt will be important. Obviously, we're mainly advising operators who are acquiring, licensed spectrum, and also dealing with regulators who are in the process of allocating it. So that's been the focus of my presentation. You're absolutely right, Graham, that there'll be other spectrum will become available, license exempt, and Wi-Fi. So yeah, not to say that that's not important, but obviously focus of my presentation has been on the licensed spectrum, where if you're going to invest vast amounts in building cellular networks, you need to be sure that you have access to the spectrum and that there aren't significant interference issues. I think your second question about do the operators have sufficient money to acquire all of these licensed frequency bands, I think is a very good one. It is an issue if the prices are set too high, then as they've shown in the past, they won't buy it. And I think regulators do need to be, and governments need to be realistic about how much money will be spent by operators on these frequencies. So, and particularly when you're allocating huge amounts of spectrum, you can't take the prices that you once got for for legacy spectrum, and assume you're going to get the same price per megahertz for the new spectrum that's about to be allocated. It simply won't work.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Scott. And I am conscious we're kind of moving towards the end, having to move on to the panel. But one other question, which I had, if I may. So, I mean, in your presentation, you talked about prices of 5G spectrum across different countries and looked at the situation in Europe and things as well. Just wondered how you've seen the overall prices that have been seen for 5G awards across different regions, how they've varied. Has there been kind of patterns that have been seen across different regions? Has there been differences or similarities in prices that have been seen?
Well, there are regional variations. We have actually looked at the whole issue of spectrum pricing. I mean, not just 5G, but if we go back and looked at 3G and 4G, it's quite interesting actually that there wasn't. You would think there would be a very strong correlation sometimes between GDP per capita and spectrum pricing, but actually it's only loosely correlated. If you go back 10 years, some of the most expensive auctions happened in some of the developing countries. I'm thinking of India there, some of the auctions. So it is only loosely correlated. Clearly, the biggest thing that drives spectrum pricing in any given market is the availability and the demand, supply and the demand. And we've seen a number of countries, particularly in Europe, for example, where regulators have constrained the amount of spectrum available. I'm thinking particularly of Italy, where there were 4 operators and only, I think, 200 megahertz of C-band spectrum, and that drove a bit of a bidding war. And the way that lots were structured, it drove very, very high prices for that spectrum. Fortunately, I think most regulators take the view that they will allocate as much of the spectrum as they can. So that's that's a big driver. So the devil's in the details in all these things. If you want to, if a regulator wants to try and engineer scarcity, they can, and therefore drive the prices up. Yeah.
Perfect, Scott. Well, look, thank you so much for that. And as I said, I think that's a fantastic way to kick off our day. One other thing just to mention, I've seen in the chat that whilst Scott has been speaking, his colleague Stefan has put his contact details there, saying that if anyone wants a detailed report on spectrum pricing that is available from Coleago Consulting, then please do get in touch. And Stefan's details are in the chat, or you can get in touch with Scott as well using the chat function on the platform. So that's it, Scott. Thank you very much once again. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next up, we'd like to continue the discussions on 5G, and we're moving to our next session, our first panel of the day, where we're going to be asking key stakeholders what are their hopes, plans, and expectations for 5G. So without further ado, I would now like to welcome to the stage our moderator for that session. So that's Shiv Bakshi. Shiv, welcome, and a particularly warm welcome to you, because I know that it's basically the middle of the night where you are there. So we really appreciate you joining us for this session at this time, and I hope you've got plenty of coffee. But that said, I will pass over to you, and we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I hope you have been enjoying the sessions over the past 3 days as much as I have. And I think it's a tribute to communication technologies and also to the hard work of Dan and the team at Forum Global that a minor event like a global pandemic has not been allowed to be an impediment to the meeting of hearts and minds. Great job, Dan. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shiv Bakshi, and I'm a vice president in Ericsson's Group Function Technology, which in plain English means the Office of the CTO, and I'm the group's point person for Africa and Middle East. It's my great privilege today to moderate this session. As Dan pointed out, the session is framed in terms of a question to key stakeholders. What are your hopes, plans, and expectations for 5G? African administrations, if you remember, demonstrated a lot of enthusiasm for 5G if the results of the last World Radio Conference are any indication. And while extensive rollout of 5G networks across Africa may be a bit in the future, most countries across the region are developing their rollout plans and building their 5G roadmaps. This session provides an opportunity for key stakeholders from across the region to outline their hopes and expectations that they have of 5G and the ways in which they plan to exploit the promise of this new technology. We have four great panelists today. Richard McGottler of ICASA, Daniel Obam, the Communications Secretary of the National Communications Secretariat at Kenya, Jake Mongalo, who's a Technical Regulatory Manager at MTN in South Africa, and Damien Ndzidze, who is a consumer advocate and is a council member of Consumers International based out of Rwanda. Um, the rules for the session that we have agreed upon are as follows. Each panelist will have about 7 minutes to make his opening remarks and offer his reflections with or without slides. I think most of them will take the privilege of using slides. I'm expecting them to articulate the socioeconomic and socio-political challenges in their respective societies and how they think 5G might help alleviate some of the more pressing problems and challenges. I'm sure they will also talk about what is next for spectrum by way of allocation and use, and how connectivity providers may use that spectrum and the potential bandwidth that should be available to ensure the benefits of 5G are maximized for society. Following their opening remarks, we'll have a discussion with the panelists and then we will take your questions. But before we get to all of that, and in the interest of ensuring that we all have a shared understanding of what exactly are we talking about when we are talking about 5G, allow me to present a few slides as a way of, say, level setting, for the lack of a better term. So could you please? Yes, thank you. So, when we look at mobile generations across time, we have seen that historical, from first to second, second to third, and third to fourth generation, we see that historically we have talked about higher peak data rates, denser infrastructure, and more bandwidth. And these three elements have been the hallmark of each new generation, right? Access technologies and new air interfaces have been the center of attention. Next slide, please. Um, one more click. Yes. One more. Okay. Now, in the case of 5G, it is somewhat different. Yes, there is a lot of conversation about access, but this this generation is more like a network platform, where a common network platform designed to serve multiple industries and multiple use cases, each with a very different set of requirements, right? So the idea is that digitizing industries can be served with dynamic and secure network slices. So if you are in agriculture, your needs of the spectrum are going to be somewhat different than if you are in automotive industry, or if you are in health, or if you are in some other industry, right? So we offer the industry offers the network up as a network slice. If you go to the next slide. And while doing that, the core network becomes as much important as the access network that we are all very familiar and we talk about all the time. So when you think of 5G network as a platform, the intent is to sort of move away from dedicated physical network resources for different applications to create a pool of these resources, which you see as physical resources at the bottom: access, connectivity, computing, storage, what have you, and then provide a slice of the network which is software defined to a particular industry, right? What this does is it lowers the cost of offering services, it lowers the cost of experimentation, and thus the platform becomes an invitation for innovation to various industries, who each, when they build network for their own specification won't have to spend the money on all these pooled resources, and they can tap into the general pool to be able to sort of get the slice that they want of the network for the functionalities that they have in mind. Next slide, please. So think about it this way. You have the network platform at the bottom with connectivity, mobility, capacity, all these wonderful things, reliability, what have you, as a shared pool at the bottom. That's the platform, the network. And then specific services can be offered to specific segments in the market. Consumers might be more interested in uh, using their smartphone for this, that, and every other purpose. For gaming, consumer residential might want to benefit from the fixed wireless access element of it and IoT elements in as in smart homes. You have the enterprise, which is going to be more interested in various other applications, and then the government might want public safety, drone control, and smart cities and everything else. So different market segments can benefit from the same platform that the network provides, right? Next slide. So the reason all this is possible is that 5G boosts performance in 8 different dimensions, from latency, improvements in latency, to improvements in device connection density, to battery life, to position accuracy, peak rates, etc. So we take all of that. Next slide. And that comes together to become an enabling environment, so that in the case of 5G, we are not looking for a killer app. 1,000 flowers can bloom because 5G builds that shared enabling environment for all kinds of use cases, for all kinds of industries, which is why when you talk about 5G, you hear a lot about use cases, both present and future. Next slide. Now, when you think of use cases, I kind of point to 4 major categories of use cases. 2 that speak to the network as a platform, where you have can we expand the slide? Thank you. Where you have machine type communication, both massive machine type communication and critical machine type communications. These are where the platform addresses the industry's needs and societal transformation. And then you have 2 other use cases of enhanced mobile broadband and fixed wireless access, where the network speaks to the cost effective delivery of increased data traffic that we are likely to see with the enablement of 5G and the enablement of the environment with it. Um, and I think with this as a background, I should like to invite, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So with this as the background, thank you. We can now invite the panelists to speak about 5G, their hopes, their aspirations, and their expectations of the technology as it is deployed in their societies. So with that, and without further ado, I would like to invite my friend Richard to speak his piece, and after that, Daniel, and then Jake, and then Damien. So, Richard, welcome. The floor is yours, my friend.
Yes. Good morning, colleagues, and good evening, Chief, where you are. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And thanks, Dan, for the opportunity to present at this conference. We will talk to the issues and the plans as we had as of the time 2014. The next slide will talk to In the presentation, in the outline, we will talk about an overview, the roadmap, the IMT roadmap, and the emerging capabilities, the traffic forecast, the IMT roadmap, IMT 2020 planning, recommendation and conclusion. And if we go to the next slide, we look at the overview of the IMT roadmap. In the past few years, we developed an IMT roadmap looking at the growing demand for mobile broadband in South Africa, which indicate a need for more broadband bandwidth capacity in general. And this was in the year when we were looking at the 4G development around 4G and its features. Now, at the same time, we realized that many rural areas do not have access to mobile broadband, which indicate the need for more universal mobile broadband coverage, a need caused by best served by low frequencies. At the time, we're looking at the deployment of the frequencies below 1 gigahertz. And with the realization of the fact that the ITU has identified a number of frequencies mainly intended for mobile broadband, and those are the frequencies that are already contained in the ITU radio regulations and identified for IMT. And we also recognize the fact that each country has its own unique historical frequency assignments, which brings along challenges that need creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurial solutions for the IMT implementation. Like I indicated, at the time, we were looking at the deployment of 4G coming back from the 3G development and the migration thereof. And these initiatives are to lead to the early deployment of the fifth generation network. At the time, we're looking at beyond 4G, we will be going into 5G, and these plans were geared towards more long-term thinking in terms of future development. The next slide. If you go to the next slide, yes. Yeah, so with regards to emerging technologies, as I indicated, the IMT roadmap, which we developed in 2014. So then in 2018, with the 5G in the horizon, we actually upgraded and that development with a long term of looking at the implementation of 5G in the future, and including the fact that the demand for increased data and implementation of major technologies such as the fifth generation network and allocation of spectrum is more important going forward. And therefore, there was a need for us to develop that long-term kind of plan. And the plan is to take into consideration the development of 5G with specific emphasis on the capabilities of 5G. And that is the three pillars in the triangle of 5G. That is enhanced mobile broadband, machine type communication, ultra reliable and low latency communications. With these capabilities, the idea was to make sure that at the time, South Africa will be ready upon the need to start deploying 5G. The next slide will go through to we also made a forecast of the traffic as of 2010 to looking at forecasting the traffic demand and with the realization that by 2020 we'll have exponential increase in the growth of traffic. And the thinking was, with this focus, we were able to identify the amount of spectrum that will be required for the deployment of these networks, including 5G. And I think with that long-term plan, it actually assisted us in planning forward, so that by the time 5G comes into place, we are actually ready. And I must say, I think in South Africa, in terms of spectrum, we're fairly ready with given the focus that we made. The next slide is on the issues around the goal set for IMT roadmap. As I indicated, the 2014 roadmap was looking more at the features of IMT Advanced, which is IMT Advanced is the ITU word for what is now called 4G in industry. And so then in 2019, we actually focused for additional requirements and looking at the requirements for 5G, and realized that for 5G deployment, you need low, mid, and high band frequencies in order to be able to ensure that these deployments are realized and successfully realized. Because in South Africa, we license on a technology and service neutral basis, and this enables operators to be able to refarm the spectrum without necessarily having to change their license. So it is important that as a country, we need to start releasing the low and mid and high frequencies and prioritize that for the successful deployment of 5G. And Africa, therefore, is encouraged to adopt the vision for IMT 2020, which gives all the 13 requirements which are to be met for systems and standards to qualify for 5G. And this vision gives us an opportunity to actually plan for the long term for the deployment of 5G. The next slide is on the, if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so in the planning process, what we need to ask ourselves a few questions. And the first question would be, why should Africa be involved in the matters regarding 5G? And secondly, the relationship between appropriate spectrum and the standard in Africa. And this is to ensure that the standardization gap that exists between developed and developing countries, as identified in Resolution 44 of WTSA 2008, is actually realized. So in 2008, there was a realization that there's a need to close the gap between developed and developing countries. And as Africa, we need to, as much as possible, to try and close that gap and make sure that we move as fast as practically possible. The next slide will be on the recommendation. It is important to ensure that developing countries experience the economic benefits associated with technology development and to better reflect the requirements and interests of developing countries in the standardization process. And also to facilitate increased participation of developing countries in standardization, so as to ensure that developing countries experience the economic benefits associated with technology development, and to better reflect the requirements in the standardization process. Just to indicate that as Africa, at least in this cycle, we managed to participate in the standardization process by evaluating the IMT 2020 standards and the technologies that is to be deployed for 5G. So it is important to close that gap in terms of developed and developing countries. The next slide is on the recommendation. I see I have 1 minute left. So, so it is important for Africa to establish the 5th generation network forum with lessons and initiative, with the lessons learned from other developing countries, and Africa to continue with the development in the evaluation process of IMT 2020 standard. And Africa is to make sure that IMT spectrum for 5G includes low, mid, and high bands, while taking into consideration the benefits of regional cooperation as regard to cross-border interference and economics of scale. And the benefits thereof are fairly high, because harmonization is very important, and it's important for Africa to harmonize in this respect. And therefore, Africa, great benefit of the establishment of 5G will be to stay connected in the 5G development. And finally, the Africa 5G Forum is to ensure that the continent is part and parcel of the mainstream of the policy and regulator development. That's facilitating the process of placing the necessary frameworks, including making the frequency spectrum available in a timely manner as appropriate. With these few words, let me thank you very much, moderator. My process.
Thank you, Richard. And we will come back, I'm sure, during the discussion phase with questions that people might want to pose to you for clarification. So thank you once again. And Daniel, you're up, my friend.
Thank you, Shiv.
There you go.
First of all, let me take this opportunity to thank Forum Global for giving me this chance to talk to distinguished delegates. I'm also humbled to be on a panel with such a distinguished group of panelists. I've been asked, next slide, please. I've been asked to talk about my hopes and expectations for 5G, issues of spectrum needs that need to be made available, and how this should be allocated, and how the connectivity providers can use this bandwidth to ensure that 5G benefits are maximized. I'll talk generally, and where appropriate, I'll give some examples from my experience here in Kenya. And I think the stage has been set very well by Scott and by Shiv in their presentations. So perhaps I'll just be reinforcing some of the things that they have already said. Next slide, please. I would like to say that right now there's a lot of discussion about digital transformation in our countries, African countries, be it from the African Union, Smart Africa Alliance, or even within the sub-regional economic blocks. For example, in East Africa, there started discussions about having a single digital market in East Africa, which can then translate maybe into these regional blocks, East Africa, Southern Africa, Western Africa, these single digital regional blocks converging into a continental single digital market. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which aims at boosting intra-Africa trade and Africa's global trading. We rely on connectivity to be able to achieve these objectives, because without connectivity, with a lot of activities going online, we'll not be able to achieve the single digital market for Africa. Going to the topical issue, COVID pandemic has actually demonstrated the importance of connectivity. We've seen connectivity move from the offices, from institutions of learning to the home, where appropriate, you are having students taking lessons from home. Platforms have become really important. E-commerce, people shopping for goods online, being delivered their homes. At least here in Kenya, that is really, supermarkets are actually delivering a lot of stuff at home. Communication, I'm sure you all, after this, you'll probably go into another Zoom or Teams or WebEx meeting. The communication platforms have become very, very important. Delivery of government services. In Kenya, some offices are not open for physical visits. So you want to get services, you have to go online. All these are being enabled by connectivity. So in terms of hopes and expectations, I think that 5G should come and solve our development targets, be they the SDGs. In Kenya, we have what we call the Big Four agenda: affordable housing, affordable healthcare, food security, which is agriculture, and manufacturing to provide jobs for the youth. So I would expect that 5G will provide the required high capacity access at home to allow for remote working and remote education. Will enable platforms that allow us to interact and transact. Will provide us the necessary tools to achieve our Big Four agenda that I've outlined. And also the issue of public safety, because we need to have all this happening in a secure environment. Next slide, please. So in terms of the spectrum and which spectrum should be made available, here I'm just displaying what the whole range of spectrum that is there. But I believe that we should focus on the low bands and the mid bands, which have already been standardized. For example, the 2.5, 2.6, and the C band, where this has already been identified for mobile, and the low bands, the UHF band, the 800, the 700. Why? Because the devices are there, and already there are networks that use this. So I think this can provide us with a seamless, integration to existing networks. There's a discussion about. I think Graham, who from Microsoft, who talked about no mention of unlicensed. I prepared this before his question. So actually, unlicensed plays a very important role. Right now, I'm actually using a Wi-Fi connectivity. So in addition to licensed, we also need to focus on unlicensed to augment the deployment of networks. So we have to have a combination of licensed and licensed, both existing and, if possible, in future, to make sure that 5G is the 5G vision is achieved. Next slide, please. Let me talk a little bit about how I think spectrum should be allocated, but I'll do this from a broad policy perspective. I believe that we need, as Africans, to prioritize freeing up of licensed and shared spectrum for 5G for both commercial and other users in the mid and high bands. I've already talked about that. Given the work we do at the ITU, where we harmonize spectrum internationally, I think we need to go to those spectrum bands that we've already harmonized globally, so that we have economies of scale. But while we do that, as countries, we retain our right as countries to allocate spectrum for domestic use in the way that we see fit, of course, taking into account the radio regulations on not interfering. And then in terms of supporting infrastructure, I think public funding is important to support things like fiber rollout and other infrastructure that's needed. We need to incentivize operators to roll out 5G in rural areas which are unserved, and we need to change our regulatory regimes. I think Scott talked about this. Some of the regulatory regimes were set up pre-liberalization days. I think we need to think in the new way, so that we facilitate the deployment of 5G. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I'm saying that an enabling policy and regulatory environment is really important for 5G to succeed, so that we promote investment and innovation. Scott talked about investment is diminishing. So we have to change our policy and regulatory frameworks to ensure that there's investment in the sector. And then I already talked about the streamlining of our regulatory regulations to frameworks to ensure that we address the emerging challenges, and flexibility in terms of 5G services and modernizing regulatory intervention. And lastly, I think the issue of technology neutrality has already been mentioned by Richard and others. And we have to be very clear that renewal process for licenses is important. I think the case of Finland, as demonstrated by Scott, where they give very long-term licenses, is important. A roadmap is important. Richard has talked about the roadmap. And I think the issue of spectrum pricing, Scott talked about it. We need to make sure that we don't price the spectrum out of the market. But the dilemma, I work for government, is that the precedent has been set where spectrum does generate a lot of money. So we have to balance the need to have affordable spectrum pricing against the need to boost the national coffers for other national development. Thank you very much, Chief.
A comprehensive presentation of, and thank you for raising some of the more contentious and challenging issues involved in the deployment and rollout of 5G networks, the issue of spectrum, everything. So with that, I will, like in Richard's case, hold off on the discussion till we have gone through the other speakers' presentations. So Jake, you are on, my friend.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the call. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I suppose, starting from Scott, at yourself, Chief, Richard, Mr. Wang, you've covered most of what I would have loved to say. So, in the interest of time, I will not repeat everything, but I'll only just highlight some pertinent issues. And I'll also not be using a presentation. So let me begin by saying that everyone deserves the benefits of a modern connected life. You know, 5G introduced us to those benefits, but my hope is that, 4G introduced us to those benefits, but my hope is that 5G will make them a daily reality. I think the COVID situation has made a compelling case for 5G, especially for enhanced mobile broadband. A case in point is the shift towards working from home, as Mr. Bam highlighted, and how it created enormous demand for broadband services. I think in a situation where 5G would have been fully in place, we would perhaps could have had, including case studies such as virtual or augmented reality to such situations, of homeschooling or working from home, even to virtual conferencing experiences like this one. 5G is key to the digital transformation of Africa, as was already mentioned by Mr. Obama, and the acceleration of the digital economy. I believe 5G will play a significant role in the execution of the African digital transformation strategy for the years 2020 to 2030, which seeks to harness digital technologies and innovation to transform African societies and economies, to promote Africa's integration, generate inclusive economic growth, stimulate job creation, break the digital divide, and eradicate poverty for the continent's socio-economic development, and ensure Africa's ownership of modern tools of digital management. It can even play a significant role in the execution of national broadband plans. It was said in some of the earlier sessions that with 5G, Africa has an opportunity to be on par with the rest of the world and not play catch-up, as has been the case with the previous technologies. However, in order to realize the full potential of 5G, there needs to be an enabling environment, which was also highlighted in this session already. There needs to be a prioritization of technology neutral licensing, rapid deployment of infrastructure. The cost of spectrum needs to be made reasonable, and also there should not be artificial scarcity. The creation of artificial scarcity of spectrum, just to name a few examples. All impediments should be removed. We also need to learn from our 4G experience when it comes to fostering technological innovation. For example, there are markets in this region where 4G cannot be fully experienced by the citizenry because some players have been given exclusivity in the rollout of 4G. I think this should not be repeated for 5G. There also needs to be adequate amount of spectrum made available and in a timeless manner to enable the rollout of new technologies. If it had not been for the ability to refarm spectrum, some markets will still not have 4G today. But refarming is not always ideal because it deprives other technologies of spectrum, thereby negatively affecting their quality of service, as was the case with 2G when 4G was introduced. Where you got a situation where the regulator has QoS KPIs for both data and voice. When you take away spectrum from 2G, the voice quality deteriorates on 2G, but then you also might be given a fine or be sanctioned for poor throughput on your 4G network. Regarding the rollout of spectrum, or regarding spectrum for the rollout of 5G, I may say, as it was mentioned in the earlier sessions, that the C-band is the primary band for 5G globally. And that bandwidth matters when it comes to throughput and rollout costs. It is therefore of importance that more spectrum is made available in this band to enable meaningful blocks to be assigned. We can consider increasing the range from 3.4 to 3.8. And this further, I think, was touched on by Mr. Obama as far as the harmonization is concerned of the bands that are already in existence. Finally, I'd like to say that 5G is all about use cases. So the needs for spectrum will differ according to the various use cases. There will be a need for all the ranges, from low, medium to high frequencies. all will be required depending on those particular use cases. Chair, I'll leave it here for now in the interest of time. I think I can touch on other things in the discussions as we proceed.
Thank you very much, Jake, for the presentation. We will come back with questions during the discussion session. And so now I'm going to request Damien to speak to the issues. As you remember, he is a consumer advocate and works for Consumer International out of Rwanda. Damien, welcome.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, all guests there present, and also the organizer of this conference for inviting me to be part of this session. I will not say more about the 5G generation because others have been said all before. I'm Lise Damien from the Council member of Consumer International, also Executive Secretary of the Rwanda Consumers' Rights Protection Organization. For this presentation, the outline was our hope and expectation for 5G, the spectrum needed to be made available to achieve this, and how would it be allocated in a way to allow it to be used as efficiently and also possible. Next slide. Next slide, please. For our hope and plan of expectation for 5G, you know that 5G is our next or the next generation of mobile wireless network technology, which is expected to start rollout in all continents at the world and Africa as well. This 5G, we hope that will improve consumer experiences and also businesses utility through the fast data transmission and more reliable connectivity. The 5G is a step change from previous generations of mobile technology, which is to enable low latency because of the time it takes to signals to travel from one side to other side. This gives a wide range of application in digital technology, which require to support innovations in Sub-Sahara, in Africa, at the continent. In developing countries, we hope that, next slide please, we hope that digital transformation of this scale has long led the promise of improving economy outcome. And we hope also that this 5G, the next generation, will continue to enable the capacity of communication services across the economy. And in developing countries, we hope that this will help in also in cross-border trade, because for the fast speed of this 5G, we hope that the economy will be improved. However, previous technology latency, we hope that from 5G, investment choices are likely to be made available when the broader economy and commercial benefits are still uncertain. With the 4G, 3G, and so on. So Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. If we talk about spectrum needed for the 5G to be available, at the beginning, when they were talking about 5G, for consumers, they were thinking that it was a dream because of the investments and also for the improvements that was done for 4G. And also everything, we know that with the 5G, everything will be connected and internet will be faster than before. To allow this, it's needed to provide timely and affordable access to the right amount of the spectrum. So the tip of spectrum, which is combined of these bands, we have 3 spectrum bands categories, and those 3 band categories are range in have a different range, and also from the spectrum we have a gigahertz, 1 gigahertz through above 6 gigahertz. From 1 to 6 gigahertz, it will need to deliver the best services because we'll have the middle range and also the low band, middle band, and high bands for the spectrum. So for the spectrum, for 1 gigahertz, with a range of 800 to 900 megahertz bands, this will provide good 5G coverage, which will support wide area of connectivity. For the middle range spectrum band, it's ranged from 1 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz bands. This provides good coverage also, but with the capacity to deploy 5G in the 3.5G bands. So for the spectrum, we have also the high range, which is 6 gigahertz in microwave, from 16 to 50 gigahertz, which is enabler of ultra high speeds. So I think for the service providers, we help consumers to have a good network. So it's why we hope that to be for 5G to be made available, it needs a regulator to be involved in this sector. Also, the government and service provider to work together. Next slide. As I said, for the 3 bands for 5G spectrum needed for 5G, all 3 have important roles to play. The low bands, it supports widespread coverage. This will help in urban area, suburban area, and rural areas, and will help support internet services. The middle bands, typically it offers a good mixture of coverage and capacity benefits. So we hope that for the availability of spectrum needed for 5G, the majority of a commercial 5G network are relying on spectrum with the 2.8 gigahertz range. So this will help to mixture all coverages for the capacity and benefit for consumers. For the high bands are needed because the broadband itself has a speed for 5G from 26 gigahertz to 40 gigahertz, 28 to 40 gigahertz. Don't have the most international maritime support. With the providers of the bandwidth, we think that connectivity providers, go to the next, please. Go to the next slide. For our hope on connectivity providers used to the bandwidth, we think that, we hope that with the 5G new network connectivity, we hope that service providers will provide greater bandwidth. So giving higher download speeds and also to 10 gigabytes per second. So we know that for 4G, it was difficult to avail a greater network and a greater bandwidth. But for 5G, we hope that there will be a change because 5G will be faster than 4G. So to transfer from 4G to 5G, there will be a high resolution movie or other services. For example, to pick downloading features will be helping because 5G have a fast speed and we go from taking 7 minutes to just also a few seconds.
Damien, talking of time, we are kind of hoping that we can move on to discussion. So if you would please go a little faster by way of conclusion, that would be very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, the presenter, and I think this is our hope and expectation for 5G. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Damien. I didn't mean to cut off. We can come back to, other elements that you might want to sort of highlight during the discussion. But let's get back. I don't see Daniel. Perhaps there you go. So a whole bunch of issues were raised by the panelists. I would like to sort of give each of you a minute or two to sort of come up with any comment you might have after listening to your colleagues. If there's some rejoinder that you have or some additional thought that occurs to you once you have listened to your fellow panelists, this is the time. Richard?
Well, yeah, no, thank you very much, Person. I think we're actually converging in terms of thinking, and I think the thoughts provided give us hope into the future deployment of 5G to the benefit of the society in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel? Can't hear you.
Sorry, I'd muted myself. I was saying that there's convergence right from the beginning with Scott, with the moderator's introductory remarks, with the presentations from each of the panelists. Definitely, there are a lot of hopes and expectations that 5G will deliver, especially on connectivity, on economic development or economic transformation and betterment of the life of our people in the continent. So I think the next stage would just be now, how do we translate these hopes and aspirations we have into concrete action plans that can actually be seen to benefit the man on the street, as we say. Thank you.
Thank you. Jake?
Thank you, Chief. Yes, as I've mentioned in my earlier talk, most of what we are saying is quite common. There is indeed that convergence, and it's encouraging to see that there is that convergence. So the important thing now is to get things happening. 5G is already present on the continent. In the south is already there, but if we can just make it, like in the South African case, the spectrum becoming made available so we can implement. So that is very encouraging. So the harmonization that we had that needs to happen, we're looking forward to that. So now the issue is the speed at which we implement all these plans that we have highlighted today.
Thank you. Damien, you have any thoughts that you want to add?
Thank you, Eric. Based on the previous generation, we hope that the 5G will improve and consumers will be happy with the new generation. We think that even though the governments and business owners will be a benefit to this new generation. And we hope that in Africa, all developing countries will improve the businesses and also will improve the life. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Richard, there's one question from Lyndon Petzer for you. The traffic forecasts on your slide 5, are these forecasts for South Africa, or are these, what region are we talking about? The traffic forecast that you have, the highest growth forecast in, etc. In one of your slides. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you very much for the question. In 2014, in the ITU during the study cycle, there was a study requirements to identify the requirements and the need for IMT spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And this report or recommendation was developed within the Working Party 5G as part of the study process. Now, at the same time, it was the time that we were developing the IMT roadmap, we actually adapted it to actually make up extrapolate it and indicate the need for South Africa. Hence, we were able to, in the roadmap at the time, we managed to identify that by 2020, we'll need about 956 megahertz of spectrum using this kind of this report. So it's an ITU report which has been domesticated in order to come up with the forecast.
So the forecast is for South Africa.
Yes.
These numbers.
So,
yes. Okay. All
yeah.
right. Thank you. Several of you have raised the question of economic blocks, or where you could come together as an area of, or a group of countries like SADC or IACO or ECOWAS or what have you. That requires a lot of coordination, right, between the countries with respect to the pace at which things might happen, and a lot of harmonization. So one of the questions that is, how important is it that countries are working together on their 5G strategies? And how do you harmonize the pace at which things might happen in a community of countries in any one sub-region of Africa? Any thoughts? Yes, Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. But the chief for the East Africa countries, the economic bloc is called the East African Community. IACO is the organization of the regulators and the industry. Most of these economic blocks, be it East Africa Communities, SADC, or ECAS, or even ECOWAS, they already have frameworks for harmonization, not just in our sector, but in other sectors, because the intention is to have free flow of trade, goods, and services across the borders of these countries. In our region, our biggest trading partners as Kenya are actually our neighbors because of the East Africa Community Treaty, which calls for harmonization. So it's easy to do the harmonization because of these already existing bodies like IACO, WATRA in West Africa, CRASA in Southern Africa, and others. So the frameworks for harmonizations are already there. And that's why you see, even when we go to the WRC, we normally come with common positions from these economic blocks into the African position. And that is now, out of that, now we can go to add to and present a common platform. In terms of what is happening, I think it's important that we harmonize our strategies as Africa so that we present a single market to investors, to device manufacturers, to be able to benefit from economies of scale.
Absolutely.
There are efforts happening at the regional level and even at the African Union level, where there are efforts to try and have harmonization so that we identify key spectrum for IMT across the continent. That way, it reduces interference, cross-border interference, and also, as I've mentioned, brings in the issue of economies of scale because we agree on certain spectrum bands. And therefore, if we can even harmonize our roadmaps, I think that can perhaps bring in investment because we'll be providing a common platform for investors.
Absolutely.
5G. Thank you.
Richard, thank you, Daniel. Richard, are you seeing the same?
Yes, no, I agree fully with my Daniel. We just to add that in SADC we do have common guidelines that we develop around all the issues around spectrum and others. Now, just this year, the CRASA Electronic Communication Committee has started to develop a harmonized 5G long-term plan. So it is a document that is being developed, which is to ensure there's a long-term roadmap for SADC. And the same idea would be actually communicated through the R2 process as well. So we are currently in the process of developing a long-term roadmap for 5G. Thank you.
Thank you. So, anybody else wants to add something? Jake, Damien?
Yes, I can say it is quite important, especially for operators like ourselves who operate in multiple countries. I mean, MTN is almost in close to 20 African countries. So the greater the alignment across the countries, the better it is. It will help with the economies of scale and the reduction of costs of deployment of these technologies. But also, I think the issue of harmonization or of collaboration, I think it was a major theme also in the Global Symposium for Regulators this year, that, there needs to be greater collaboration, even from the regulatory space.
Thank you. Yes, please, Damien, go ahead.
For the issue of pricing, also for the private service providers, also to harmonize the prices in Africa, also in East Africa. We know that there is a rooming in East Africa, but for the price they didn't, and there is no change about the price from country to another. So it could be better for the regulators to look about it, and also for the policymakers in East Africa to look about this issue. to harmonize the prices in East Africa.
Thank you. Daniel.
Quick one.
Go ahead, Daniel. Yeah.
The one network roaming in East Africa has a price change. Before, we used to pay like $3 or $4 per minute when we travel to Rwanda, Uganda, and South Sudan. With the one network roaming that was put in place among the Northern Corridor countries, now it's about 10 cents, 10 US cents. What we've seen is traffic increase of more than 2,000 times, 2,000% as a result of reducing that roaming. So there's no roaming. So definitely there's been a price change due to the one network roaming. I just wanted to clear that point. Thank you.
Thank you for doing that. I have one quick question. The industry, if you look at what's happening globally, is seeing enhanced mobile broadband and fixed wireless access as the two early use cases for 5G across most of the world, right? While other cases are being developed and piloted, these two are very definitely the ones that we are seeing. Yes, we are seeing a lot of collaboration with industries taking place with respect to massive IoT and other stuff, and with critical communications. But these two, enhanced broadband and mobile broadband and fixed wireless access, are the two very early benefits of 5G that most economies across the world that are deploying 5G are looking at. Is that your understanding also, that those are going to be the early use cases in Africa? Anybody? Yes, Daniel.
Yes, for me, that's why in my discussion, I talked about connectivity being important. I didn't mention fixed wireless access and enhanced mobile broadband. I can relate this to a story. I think this was not an African who said this. You have to give people bread first before you give them cake. Or if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are the basic needs, then there's self-actualization. Augmented reality, low latency, important, yes. But the thing COVID has taught us that connectivity to the home, to the school, to the workplace, on digital platforms to provide public services online are important. So I think those two are important. The others are important, but for me, these would be the ones that we start looking at immediately. Second point about this, that with those two, I can still use my Wi-Fi device to connect. So I don't need to have additional user devices. So that's my opinion. That is where I would start with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Richard, do you think the same? What about you, Jake? So let's start with Richard and then Jake. You okay, Richard?
Oh, yes. Key is very, very much key in terms of ensuring that citizens are connected, but also the application of the capabilities of all the capabilities for 5G are also key important factors that will ensure that even in the rural areas, those who are in rural areas do benefit from those benefits of those capabilities. For instance, you could have remote surgery in terms of all these being applied, even if you are in rural areas where there's no access. So I must say that all these key capabilities are important to both urban and rural to ensure that the society in general universally benefit to the capabilities of 5G.
Absolutely. So, our friend from MTN, rural connectivity, inclusiveness, trying to bridge the digital divide, especially in these times of the pandemic, are absolutely on everybody's mind. Is that how you guys are thinking about it? The deployment of 5G early stages? Jake?
Yeah, and as you already mentioned, the enhanced mobile broadband or fixed wireless access would have been the emphasis, because also if you look at it, it demonstrates the fact that 5G will not just arrive one day. It's a progression, and it's only a natural progression that as you had 4G introduced, there's broadband, then the first use case of 5G will be related to that kind of connectivity. But of course, when we deal with the issues of rural connectivity, also there will be different spectrum needs. I mean, you could start off with, perhaps 4G in the 700 band, and then gradually move it on to 5G, and then migrate to 5G in those lower bands, especially in the rural setting.
Thank you. And Damien, you will be very happy to hear that connectivity and bridging the digital divide, bringing everybody online, being as inclusive, should be music to your ears, right?
Yes, with 5G, I think there will be an improvement in Africa for the developing countries. So what we hope is that the service providers have to work together so to improve this connectivity. So for the connectivity for country block, we need also the government to invest more.
Of course.
To invest more in 5G as a new generation.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time, so I will take this opportunity to thank the panelists. Richard, Daniel, Jake, Damien, thank you very much for sharing your insights. And thank you to everybody for the privilege of hosting this. I was very happy and very grateful to friend Dan and everybody else at Forum Global. So with that, Dan, I will hand this back over to you. Thank you once again, and a big hand for all my panelists.
Thank you, Shiv, and I would echo that. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. And Shiv, thank you to you as well. It was a fascinating session, so thank you very much. And yeah, really appreciate that. And I think the session now and also the presentation by Scott have been a great way to kick off the discussions we've got on 5G. And we're going to be very shortly moving on to another session looking at 5G. If I can get the slides up here next to me, here we are. So very shortly, we're going to be having another session looking at 5G. So we're going to be having the session that's looking to continuing the path towards a harmonized continental 5G strategy. And for those of you who've attended this conference in person in the last couple of years, you may recognize that we have had that session on that similar topic for the last couple of years as well. So it's kind of an ongoing session that we have, and looking at kind of updating where we are and looking at that path towards that important harmonization across the region. So that's going to be here in around about, we're running slightly late, so that's going to be in around about 7 or 8 minutes or so back here on the main stage. But we do just have a few minutes before that for you all to try the networking area. So we have about 7 minutes, as I say, before the start of the next session. So we would like to invite you during that time to please go and make use of the networking area. For those of you who haven't used it before, it's the left-hand menu, and you click onto the networking area, click on ready, and you'll be linked up to another participant who is attending at the event and have the opportunity to connect with them there. So 7 or 8 minutes for you to do that, and then we'll be back here on the main stage at 11:50 Central Africa time for the start of the next session. So looking forward to seeing everyone back here then. And once again, a big thank you to all of our speakers, panelists, and to Shiv for moderating this morning's session. Thank you very much, and see you back here shortly.